Aston Martin's dramatic jump to produce arguably the second best car on the grid has prompted many comments from rivals that it's simply a Red Bull clone. Sure, last year's Aston Martin did go down the Red Bull concept route, and Aston's technical director Dan Fallows was head of aerodynamics for Red Bull till he joined Team Silverstone in 2022, but the reality of the AMR23 is that it's far from a copy and paste job. So let's take a look at why the AMR23 is not a Red Bull clone. In terms of sidepod design, the Red Bull RB19 is almost identical to the RB18. However, Aston Martin has heavily evolved its concept this year, one first adopted by Alpine's A522 with a channel running along the length of the sidepod. The AMR23's slidepod design is much more aggressive than Alpine's though, with the slope dug much deeper in order to define the airflow's passage toward the rear of the car. And whilst other teams might also look to implement their own slide pods, their designs will inevitably vary, as each team will have to adapt to suit their own power unit and its ancillary components. Luckily, if other teams want to investigate the concept, they can do so knowing that the AMR23's bodywork isn't shrink-wrapped to the internal components. There are hollow internal sections used to sculpt the sidepod shape and improve the external flow around the car. One area where Red Bull and Aston Martin are similar is that they both sport the high-waisted engine cover solution. However, Aston Martin has continued to develop the concept, utilising a similar solution to the slide pod with the central portion dug out to help improve the airflow's behaviour as it travels to the rear of the car. The side pods and engine cover should already be enough proof that the AMR23 and the RB19 aren't similar, but there are plenty of other important differences elsewhere. The most obvious is the internal DNA. Red Bull has its own Honda-based powertrain, whilst Aston Martin purchases its power unit, gearbox and rear suspension from Mercedes. This limits Aston Martin in many ways, as it's effectively locked into decisions taken by Mercedes, with the rear suspension using a pull rod arrangement as one example. Meanwhile, Red Bull made the switch to push rod in 2022 and stuck with it for this year, which results in a different packaging mythology for the inboard components. Those elements are housed on top of the gearbox casing, allowing more freedom in the shapes used in the lower half of the casing. This also results in more freedom when designing the underfloor and diffuser too. The opposite could be said for Aston, as its inboard components are housed in the bowels of the casing, reducing their design scope where the underfloor tunnels meet with the diffuser. That being said, it does have some weight distribution benefits, with a clearer route for the exhaust pipe work and having the cooling elements in a more central position. It's a similar story at the front too. Whilst Aston doesn't purchase its front suspension from Mercedes, it retains the more conventional push rod arrangement, whereas Red Bull uses a pull rod layout. Different layouts suit different cars of course, but these decisions are usually driven by aerodynamics. The suspension arms are, in many ways, a burden in that respect, but designers use the suspension fairings as much as possible to alter the airflow trajectory from the front wing and nose to the side pods, floor fences and underfloor. In Red Bull's case, it opted for quite an extreme solution in 2022, with a forward monoarm of the upper wishbone mounted as high as possible on the chassis. The rear arm was mounted low down, not only in order to help direct airflow, but also to help with a more aggressive anti-dive geometry. It's worth noting that Red Bull made changes to its suspension layout for 23, as the wheelbase of the RB19 has been extended slightly. This not only affects everything we've just mentioned, it also alters the wheel assembly's position relative to the front wing, floor and side pods. This obviously has an impact on the front wheel's aerodynamic wake, which is constantly changing, given the vertical displacement of the chassis and steering angle, meaning the tyre position is never the same. Shifting the front axle line forward tips the balance slightly by reducing the tyre wake's impact. It should also result in a more stable platform under braking and acceleration, which in turn reduces the centre of pressure shift and produces a more predictable ride height window. This can help both reduce the possibility of porpoising and allow the designer to be more aggressive with the underfloor and diffuser. Moving back, yet another difference can be seen when comparing rear wing designs. Red Bull runs with much less wing relative to the rest of the field, let alone Aston Martin. This not only suggests that it has much more downforce at its disposal and can balance the car at each circuit accordingly, but it also means that it will be quicker in the speed traps as it's carrying less drag. Plus, this also has a huge benefit in terms of the DRS boost, which has emerged as one area where Red Bull has a massive advantage right now. Overall, there are numerous clear design variations between the AMR23 and the RB19, from the foundations all the way up to the minute details. It will be interesting to see how both cars develop from here on, and whether Aston can truly match Red Bull throughout the rest of the season.